All right, so that's kind of the chemistry part. We'll move into perception and management. So I talked about tannins as liking to stick to stuff. This is kind of our conceptual model for how we think of tannins as being astringent. These little purple things are tannins. This is your salivary protein. They tend to stick to that. They aggregate, precipitate, and they fall out of solution, and that what gives rise to the astringency response.
Can you talk about the precipitation again?
Absolutely.
What precipitation are you talking about?
This stuff here falls out of solution. And so as it falls out of solution, it moves everything over in this direction, and you actually lose your salivary protein. And that salivary protein is what keeps things nice and slippery in your mouth. And so if you take a new red wine, you put it in your mouth over a couple of times, you're constantly throwing this out. Your body's ability to keep producing salivary protein is limited, right? And so it takes a little while for your palate to recover. That's why you have to chew on some crackers, drink some water, eat some bread to try to help your palate recover. Get some of this back so you can taste some more wine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess the reason I was confused was because I'm thinking about, you're not talking about precipitation over time in a wine, but
no, this is in your mouth. Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. So this is spent some time talking about the tannin component, and we know from a lot of studies, more tannin in a wine, more astringent the wine. All other things being equal. Winemakers, really, who's on the winemaking side here? Anyone on grape growing side? Interesting. I like doing these polls.
Well, since you mentioned that, you've mentioned a couple times managing tannin in the vineyard. Do you have ideas about that?
Yeah.
We're interested in that.
Okay. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit about that, I think. In the winery, composition is a real important part. You do think about composition, but you think about it differently. And you're just looking at practices in the fermenter. Oftentimes just emphasizing how much do I want to crush my fruit? Do I want to destem or not destem? Do I want to do a pump over or a punch down? What's the frequency of the pump over, punch down? All of these things. What's the temperature of my ferment, my cap? Those things all affect the composition of the tannin at the time of press, okay? How much time you let it soak. All of those things will ultimately affect the structure of the tannin that has been extracted. Because probably from a primary standpoint, you're selecting for skin tissue versus seed tissue. You're selecting for stem tissue potentially. And those temperature, time, cap management variables absolutely affect seed tannin, skin tannin, stem tannin. And so there's a lot of variables going on. The bottom line, though, is we want to perceive tannin up here, and we have to perceive that tannin through a lot of things that have been shown to impact how we perceive the tannin. So all of these things, oxidation of the tannin, glycerol has been thought of, or other polysaccharides, manage how or affect how we perceive the tannin, the acidity of a wine, ethanol in the wine, aromatic compounds. How would an aromatic compound affect perception? Some people thought that, but this is a crazy thing. Tannins are typically present in wine in parts per thousand levels, and a lot of these aromatics, and the one that we often think about is that's a green wine, and it's pyrazines. Those things are present in wine at parts per trillion. So you've got parts per thousand here and parts per trillion here. There's nothing that, in my mind, would say that a part per trillion compound is going to affect this compound. What is alive and well is cognitive perception. And I was at a talk last week where we had the psychologist talking to us about different psychological and how we perceive the world. And as mammals, as humans, you are just programmed to take in information and draw conclusions based on that information. A lot of those conclusions are based upon unconscious triggers and cues. And if you smell pyrazines, you've already locked and loaded that wine as being green. And 10 times out of 10, you're going to say the tannin is green too. And it may or may not have anything to do with the tannin itself. So that's why everyone always cautions that, always, it looks great in the cellar, you're freaking got Mozart going, you're tasting your wine. Well, you're setting up cues to, oh, this is a good wine, So, taste in a white environment, black glasses, you can literally go overboard trying to eliminate cognitive effects. But it is important as winemakers, you have to remember that, the more you are able to block out of those unconscious cues, the better. So this is a lot of my research is really based on these tannins are bitter or astringent, and these are the adjectives that as winemakers you're trying to achieve in your system. How do we get these adjectives from this stuff? And those are the tools in the toolbox. So we can manipulate tannin concentration. I've got a bunch of tannins I can sell to you that you can absolutely affect tannin concentration with. You can also affect wine matrix. So you can adjust acidity and ethanol, residual sugar, manoproteins, and polysaccharides quite easily to affect the perception of the tannins you already have in the system. So for example, you could have a very coarse and astringent wine, and you could do a couple of things. You could egg white fine it, add a protein to that wine that'll drag out all those tannins. You could affect the acidity of it, but maybe increase the pH of that wine, and that'll reduce the impact of the astringency. You could adjust the residual sugar of that. And certainly, I live in Fresno, and there's a lot of wines that are made in the Central Valley where it's just a final sweet spot adjustment of the astringency with grape juice concentrate to get to that where you want it to be. So a lot of things that you can do on that. Tannin activity is the one that you think of as skin to seed, tannin, size distribution, color incorporation, tannin oxidation. These are the things that a winemaker is always living every year. And what you do to your wine depends on the stage of production you're at, right? And that's kind of where StellarTans have gone in terms of, yeah, it's easy to throw in a tannin, but if you can start to play with the activity of the tannin by changing the composition of the tannin, now you're changing how you might perceive that tannin regardless of concentration. So what I'm trying to do then with tannins is think about this. You put a red wine in your mouth, astringency builds, you swallow the wine and it declines. We tend to think of a red wine when we initially build that wine is that astringency tends to build up, but it tends to have a longer duration. And as winemakers, you know that, right? Wine in youth tends to have a more coarse, a harder aggression, and you know that it'll soften up over time. And what you are often seeing is a change in the shape of this astringency curve, where this height versus this duration changes shape over time. And what you see is that it shortens up in terms of duration relative to the height of that. And things that would contribute to that change in shape are large tannins, seed tannins, unpigmented tannins, and newly extracted tannins. Over here, small tannins, skin tannins, pigmented tannins, barrel-aged tannins. And that's kind of what you do on the winemaking front to try to adjust things. Okay?
A couple of slides ago, you had all these different tannin winemaking descriptors, chewy, velvety. Are those... Can you show chemically that those are different?
So I've got an algorithm for velvet tannin. You want velvety tannin? I got an algorithm. It's got 10 terms in it, but no,
okay, so those are.
Now and that's I don't know. That's the thing I love about wine. It's the wine that you're making today is not going to respond the same way as a wine that you make next year. Same vineyard, it's a different vintage, different set of variables. So every year is a new year. Every wine is a unique wine. And it's just your experience that ultimately you have to get used to that idea of, I love velvety tannins, I love silky tannins. And from my experience in this block and this sort of a vintage, this is how I can affect that adjective with my management practices.
Okay, but you can't show like... I taste these two wines. One has velvety tannins, one has dusty tannins. You can't tell me like, oh, that's because this has more of this type of tannin, this actual...
Well, what we do know is that descriptors that are associated with coarser, greener, unripe tannin versus velvety, dusty, silky tannins, I can chemically tell you the distinction between those two tannins. But you have to remember that that's not the only thing that you're perceiving, right? You're perceiving those tannins in the presence of all these other matrix elements. And that is hugely important from an adjective standpoint. I think those adjectives in the matrix are just as important as the adjectives in the tannin structure.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah.
So I'm going to walk through some of the vineyard management stuff. When I got interested in tannin chemistry, it really was initially related to tannin ripeness and development in the vineyard, okay? And I could see it. I mean, we would be tasting these wines that were clearly made from grapes that were harvested too early, and they came off as being really green, coarse tannins. And then there was these ripe tannins, these beautiful, ripe, wonderful, fleshy tannins that I loved as well. And my research initially was really focused on trying to understand that. So I did a lot of studies in the Napa Valley looking at grape development as a function of water relations to try to understand how tannin structure changed. I used to work at the Australian Wine Research Institute, and one of the things that we did over there was we worked with Hardy's Wine Company, looked at a bunch of Shirazes, and the winemakers wanted to understand how they could separate out wines based on price point. So the winemakers made a bunch of wines, 100 plus, and these are high quality wines, over $100 a bottle. These were cheap stuff, $7, $8 a bottle. And they were looking for targets, chemical targets to look at. They had locked on color. You know, traditionally it was sugar and acidity. Remember that's, and then everyone can do it. Hit a sugar acidity target, no problem, right? But that doesn't tell you the difference between a $100 bottle and a $5 bottle. So what they're looking for are chemical targets that can differentiate a $100 bottle from a $5 bottle. So initially it was color. Wow, we need color. If we can get color in our fruit, we'll give you a color bonus on your grapes, and c'est une voila, there's going to be a $100 bottle of wine. Well, the grape growers are smart people, as we all know. They optimize the color. And the winemakers quickly realize, well, color's not the only thing. There's something else. So that's when they asked the AWRI to look at it, see if we can identify another chemical target. So the next lowest hanging thing is tannin. So we analyzed a whole bunch of tannin in all these wines. And one of the things that stuck out is, as the price point went up, the proportion of skin tannin went way up. Wines that were very expensive had a ton of tannin in it and had a ton of skin tannin specifically. So that was clearly the big thing that stuck out. So one of the things that and we've seen it again and again and again, higher quality wines tend to have a more tannin structure in it that is derived from the skin. Ralph?
So would they have, in the high price point, would you see two wines that are different in terms of concentrations, but also different in terms of ratios?
Yeah.
Or similar concentrations, but also different?
I don't remember looking into that degree of detail, but there's no question that the higher price point wines had more tannin and more skin tannin proportion. So one of the things you'll notice between a really expensive bottle of wine and a really cheap bottle of wine is that it does level out. This increasing phenolic things level out in the higher price point. This just got a lot of tannin in it. There are other things that differentiate that, right? You know what the biggest one is, right? Marketing. So these guys know how to make it rare. You'd be the lucky few if you get one of these bottles. And then down here, it's other things. Oftentimes, there's a lot of things that are limiting in that wine besides phenolics. So wine quality, I'm a very firm believer in composition, that the best wine, you need to be making it in the vineyard. That's your best opportunity. How early can you start making your wine? Well, you can make it right now. These are the things that have been associated with higher quality phenolics. Higher sun exposure, lower levels of nitrogen, soil moisture, moderate canopy size. moderate crop load, low soil fertility, small berry size. What are these things all related to? I mean, it's all about limiting vine vigor, right? The more vigorous vines are, it tends to confound a lot of problems. There's more shading in the fruit zone, which makes it more susceptible to disease and so on and so forth. So the more you can open up the canopy, the more you can expose it, the better, right? The neat thing is the sunlight hits the grapeberry, it switches on some biochemical pathways. One of the biochemical pathways that switched on is tannin production. So between fruit set and veraison, that's when the tannin is made in the grapeberry. So if you can get sun exposure in that fruit between fruit set and veraison, you're going to upregulate skin tannin production. And you get more skin tannin per berry by giving that sun exposure. This is the challenge. There's no question full shade is never really a good thing in fruit. The problem is that the more exposed your fruit is, the more potential there is for sunburn. And so it's one of those balance points, right? I'm in Fresno, and you don't see many berries exposed. It's all shaded up. Yeah, it's just because of the risk of sunburn is just, you're going to get sunburn if you're out there. So here, there's some opportunity to get some exposure, right? And so it's generally for people that are in regions like this where, yeah, you're likely going to get a sunburn event at some point during the season. One leaf layer, 2 leaf layers tend to be adequate for some protection. You don't want to go full on strep here because we've all been bit in the butt right around this area, Napa as well, where you have these beautifully exposed fruit zones and they get whacked. So I always like a leaf layer, 2 leaf layers to give it adequate exposure, get some of that skin tannin, get some of that color, get some of the aromatics that do upregulate with sun exposure. This is just some work that I did in Oregon. I like to bounce around a lot. I was up at Oregon State University working along Pinot, and this is an exposure experiment we did where we were able to show that more exposure, upregulated skin production, and we actually were able to show that the proportion of skin tannin went up with the more exposure, and the absolute amount of tannin went up as well. So it's very consistent with that you get both an increase in proportion of skin tannin and an increase in the concentration of skin tannin with exposure.